We were supposed to be reading with Jeff Helson, and our project was to write about every reading that we'd ever been to or we'd ever given. I met Jeff Helson at the East West Gallery Poetry Reading Series in Notting Hill in 1995, one August evening. He was wearing a white Tintin t-shirt and talking about Charles Olson. When I came back from living in Barcelona in 2003, he invited me to read his and Sean Bonnet's series at the Poetry Cafe. They then had to relocate the month after some kind of poetry altercation. Jeff and I shared the stage with Jacques Roubaud at the Sorbonne. I read with Michael Gizzi to 3 people and a dog in the Gulf of Maine bookstore in the middle of a blizzard. I almost read with Harry Matthews at the Poetry Project, but at the last minute he couldn't fly into Paris from New York City. Jeff silenced a noisy pub in Norwich when he read poem with full stops to about 200 people. The first reading I did was at St James's Church in Piccadilly in 1987. The worst reading I ever did was at the Poetry Project in New York in about 2007. Bruce Andrews was in the front row staring very hard, and I read everything at 200 miles an hour. When Jeff Helson reads, he bobs back and forwards. I try to stand still. When we go on poetry tours, Jeff's wife always rings him. My wife never bothers. Karen McCormack at a reading in London once said that she would read Cambridge style. Steve McCaffrey did his reading London style, one standing, one sitting. Jeff and I read a collaborative poem at the wedding of Richard Parker and Jessica Pujol on the Costa Brava in 2013, and then Jeff started dancing. The happiest reading I've ever given was at Boulder, Colorado at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics alongside C.A. Conrad, M. Nobersi Phillip and Fred Moten. The strangest reading was in the Houses of Parliament and an event in support of Pussy Riot. I'm a far better name dropper than Jeff Helson. I could, for example, have sucked Allen Ginsberg's cock one summer evening in 1995, an act that would have linked me in an unbroken chain of cocksucker poets all the way back to Walt Whitman. But I didn't. The night that Stephen Roedifer passed away, I read one of his poems with Sean Bonnet. I really loved Stephen. I saw John Ashbery read in Oxford in about 1990 in the middle of winter. He looked vulnerable and miserable. I saw old Solly MacLean read in Stirling in 1987. Robert Creeley gave a talk in 1985 in which he said the reason Gertrude Stein and Louis Zukofsky had been repeatedly overlooked was due to anti-Semitism. I read in Morocco to a room in which all the men sat at the front and the women stood at the back. In 1985, I read my poems to Lady Caroline Lowell, and when I finished, she asked me to move into her house in Redcliffe Square that she lived in with Robert Lowell, so I could make use of his library. Soon afterwards, I read my poems to Peter Levy in Oxford, and he asked me to do a PhD with him, and I said I'd think about it because I didn't know what a PhD was. I remember Leslie Scalapino. I loved Leslie. I remember Stacey Doris. I loved Stacey. I acted in lots of Kevin Killian's plays when I lived in San Francisco in the early 1990s. I really loved Kevin. I read to a group of American exchange students in Cambridge in 1999 with Miles Champion, and I was so pissed off that I read my poems backwards. And Miles said, "Tom Rayworth always reads like his last reading." That's what he said, and I learned a good lesson. Jackson Maclow wasn't a great reader, but he was incandescently beautiful. I never met Kent Johnson, but he told everyone that we did. Jeff Helson always goes home from poetry after reading dinner and drinks about 6 hours later than me. I remember Michael McClure read his poems in Green Apple Books in San Francisco in a way that was just a little bit creepy. Joanne Kiger I never saw reading, but I've never stopped telling whoever will listen that one evening she leaned over her dinner table and asked for permission to kiss me. John Wieners almost set his hair on fire with a cigarette stub when he was reading at the Poetry City in Manhattan. I regularly read with my daughter Koto in my arms between 2002 and 2007. I read the whole of my 600-page book, Petrarch Collected Atkins, from 12 noon to 3 a.m. in Kennington in 2014, and only stopped for 90 minutes to talk down a nameless poet from ODing. Jeff was there when it happened. I am a much better poet than Jeff. In truth, He is a far better poet than me. You can't call him a hypochondriac, but he is most definitely an alarmist. Perhaps I read my poems on Chilean TV in 2020. I met but did not read one evening to Hilda Morley. Gary Snyder reads like a school teacher. How great it was to read with Jeff Dirksen in Vancouver at the People's Cooperative Bookstore. I met Steve Fowler in a back room at the Morden Tower in Newcastle in 2010 when we were doing a group reading for Connie Pickard. I never read with David Harson, but he did tell me that Roger McGuff told him, "Oh, David," he said, he would never be poet laureate. I haven't met that many poetry arseholes. From time to time, I've definitely been one. Towards the end of his life, poor sad old Ed Dorn could possibly have been called one. And all the tedious academic poets with their 10-minute poems and 15-minute explanations. When I read from my book 1,000 Sonnets in Cambridge, Jeremy Prynne laughed out loud at the line "brachiopods on mopeds," somebody told me. I remember standing with Jeff, Sean Bonney, Grace Lake and Stephen Roedifer at CCP in Cambridge in about 2006, all but Jeff of us smoking. El Habib Louai read his Arabic translation of Howl and other poems for 2 hours one long summer evening in my back garden. Pragita Sharma read her poems about the death of her husband another time in the same garden. One time I read with C.A. Conrad and didn't want to go on for too long because I was feeling shy, so she cut short my reading, and C.A. said afterwards that he wanted me to read longer. How many poets understand the show business adage, leave your audience wanting more? I read with Eleni Sakilianos. How happy I was to read with Eleni Sakilianos. I read once with Simon Pettit, and he said at the end of the evening that people only remember me as the poet who reads each of his poems twice at every reading. When I read my Horace poem, Stephen Roedifer shouted from the audience, "You're ripping me off, Atkins!" I've never done a reading in which I've asked the organiser if there is time to read a couple more poems. At times it is hard to tell who is who if you come from Cambridge. How great it was once or twice in this life to be a poet. I bet Jeff's out there in Santiago de Chile right now, still reading.